Hey, I want to talk a bit about the phenomenon of so-called tiger parenting and why I'm a big critic of it. Now, from the outset, I want to be clear. I'm not a parent, I'm not a father, and if that does come, I don't know at what point in my life it will. Maybe in the next few years, I just don't know. So I suppose that's an important point to put out there. But I've known people in my life who have been parents, people close to me. So I've had a sort of perspective from an observation point of view, and I've seen different types of parenting. Um, there's actually repercussions. This goes without saying as to how children are brought up. So whilst I am a believer in family matters are private, I also think that there needs to be some insight, some society as a whole has some say in how children are brought up because it inevitably has consequences. Now, I see two extremes, and I'll address those extremes in just. But what's prompted me to make this video is there's a video has emerged from China, and it's nothing unusual. It's nothing particularly out of the ordinary, but basically, it showed a teacher beating this student in a classroom somewhere. I don't know which city. It was on the Shanghai's website. Nothing particularly unusual about that because these sort of videos emerge all the time, and sometimes it's the other way where you get students behaving in a really aggressive way. But one guy was commenting and he was really advocating, he was an American, but he was advocating tiger parenting. This was a white American guy. And the sort of things that he was coming out with were so utterly absurd. The sort of rationale he was using, some of the claims he was making were just baseless. And it got me thinking about this, and it's something I have thought about before. It's something I've reflected on. I see two extremes. So, on one hand, there is a school of thought that in the Western world, particularly in the Anglo-Western world, English-speaking countries, um, the approach in schools has been too lax in recent years. That there is too much of a focus on individual development of students, because the whole parenting school spectrum obviously is interlinked. Um, so that's a big critique of the Western system, and I'm not sure if Western is even entirely accurate because no two countries are exactly the same in terms of their education system. But I think there's certainly truth in that. I do think that in many schools in the UK there's genuine behaviour problems, and I have enormous sympathy for teachers that have to put up with a lot of sometimes real serious abuse. To the point where they're forced out of work because they're suffering from severe depression because of the sort of pressure they're facing from disruptive students. Um, and I do think that there's a serious problem with parents who won't take any responsibility and they assume um, their little Sally or their little Jim is completely innocent. And I really have enormous sympathy for teachers in that position. In most Western jurisdictions, I imagine most jurisdictions around the world, it's illegal to beat children, as I believe it should be. But with that, you get certain kids who basically, it then goes to the other extreme where there is no discipline. They feel they could do anything they want. One of my subscribers, and I'm sure she won't mind me mentioning this, is from Brazil, and she mentioned that there's a real discipline problem there these days, and I think that can be replicated across the Western Hemisphere. So that's one side of the argument, and coming from a teaching background myself, I've definitely had some experience of that on some level. And teachers find themselves with their hands tied because they need to have the authority to have some discipline in class, but there are serious limits on what they can actually do. And I think to some extent that needs to be reassessed. Now, The opposite of that, the other extreme in a sense, is so-called tiger parenting. And I won't say tiger education because it doesn't really come across in the schools. I mean, in this situation, I don't know which city this was in. I don't know the exact circumstances. Clearly, based on the video, the teacher was completely out of line because she was basically physically thrashing this student, and it was completely unprofessional behaviour. I know that teachers sometimes work under enormous stress, and sometimes they have to defend themselves from violent students. But on this occasion, it just looked like she was abusing her power. Anyway, with tiger parenting, it's this philosophy that to improve your child's life, to make them a valuable human being, you need to instill extreme discipline measures. And it isn't always physical, very often it's psychological sort of abuse. And that's how I see it. I mean, I'm not going to lie here. I'm biased. I've got my opinions on this. So, I'm not pretending that I'm some sort of professor of psychology or anything. This is purely my own opinions. But basically, with this school of thought, it seems to be that the idea is, let's say, for example, a student, you get 10 students in a class and 9 of them get 99%. And then there's one student who gets 98%. Well, the hothousing or tiger mode would be that student is a failure and they need to be shamed, if not beaten. This subject has become topical in recent years. There's the Asian American commentator, in fact, I believe she was born in China, Amy Chua, very controversial figure. She published a few years ago, Battle Hymn of the Tiger Mother, I believe it was called. She's a very controversial figure, not only for the things that she advocates, but she has said things that, in my opinion, can be construed as racist. She basically made the sweeping statement that Asian mothers are superior to Western mothers. It's an absurd generalization because not all Asian parents are the same and not all Western parents are the same. Um, so aside from that polarizing sort of language, her advocacy is totally like she is arguably the most famous high profile tiger mother out there. I don't have much respect for her. I've seen a few of her speeches. I've seen her statements. I have no time for it. And what I resent is the idea that if you don't endorse that sort of school of thought, then you're a pushover. You just let your child do whatever you want. Well, the way I see it is it's two extremes. Yes, it is true. You get these parents who take no responsibility and they won't they won't put down their foot at any point at all. I think that is incredibly reckless and selfish. So, for example, I've had a situation in a coffee shop where kids have come up to me and kind of pulled at my magazine and stuff, and I've kind of looked over to their parents like, "Can you control your kid here?" And sometimes they haven't even been that bothered. Now, those sort of parents are bad parents. They're irresponsible. They just don't care. And needless to say, you get parents who are, abusive to each other, or they're drug addicts or something like this, and that more often than not then reverberates onto the child. I mean, that goes without saying. So that is one extreme. But there's, in my opinion, some very sinister undertones to the premise behind tiger parenting. And there is some serious question marks. So, for example, my question to someone like Amy Chua would be, what would her attitude be to a child who has dyslexia, right? I watched a documentary recently about dyslexia with the actress Cara Taunton. Now, she is a successful television actress. She suffers dyslexia. Um, but the mindset of it did mean in the documentary she discussed that when she was growing up, when she was in school, teachers sometimes lost their patience because they thought she was just slow. Now, the mindset of a tiger parent would be to to make them feel terrible about themselves because they're a failure. So I think that so-called tiger parenting doesn't take into account things that are often, when we're talking about learning difficulties, for example, beyond the child's control. And there's actually some rather sinister overtones to what they advocate. It almost it's like trying to create a perfect human being. as if they themselves are perfect, which of course they are not. It's one reason I have no respect for Amy Chua. I think she's incredibly arrogant. Her whole premise is that she's perfect, um, and that's why she's the world's best mother, in her opinion. Um, I think that there is a sinister overtone to this, that it's almost like trying to create the perfect human being, and common sense dictates that that cannot be done. There's another thing. You might instill your child the discipline to, have no childhood, so they're studying all the time, and yeah, it might pay off. They might get wonderful grades, but I believe the side effect of that is teaching them to basically be a sociopath. It's teaching them to be a snob and look down on anyone perceived to be a failure. And that's what I find sinister about it. It's actually creating a callous disregard for the human condition, in the sense of human beings are flawed. That's the fundamental mistake that tiger parents make. They try to create perfect human beings. There's that issue about learning difficulties. What about children with severe disabilities? What about a child born with Down syndrome? What would the tiger parent's attitude to that be? I honestly think, and this is not something I say lightly, but I honestly think these people would be happy in Nazi Germany with its policies of eugenics and experimenting to create the ideal Aryan person. Now, there's not so much of a racial component with tiger parents, obviously, but that sense of trying to create perfection, I think, is quite sinister, frankly. Um, so the way I see it is, there's nothing wrong with instilling discipline. In fact, that's very important. And I think good parents will instill discipline. So, for example, if their child is accused of bullying another child, they would take that seriously. If their child starts committing crime and so on, they're going to, absolutely need to put their foot down without question. Doesn't necessarily mean physical abuse. Personally, I wouldn't beat a child, but I would, if the situation merited it, I would certainly yell at them. I would let them know that I wasn't messing around. But the Amy Chua school of thought is to basically tell children that they're worthless unless they get perfect grades. It's kind of to shame them into that. And I think there's something rather sinister about that. And I must admit, sometimes I get very angry when I see the mentality behind these people. They, it's almost a supremacist sort of thinking. They look down on anyone else they perceive to be a failure, and it's very unsettling, to be quite honest. I've I really have no time for it. And to be clear here, I'm not talking about encouragement. I'm not talking about discipline. Nothing wrong with that. And again, I emphasize, I think that is very, very important. But I think those things are possible without tiger parenting. I mean, incidentally, holding up Asian countries to be complete role models is misleading. Suicide rates in Asian countries and East Asian countries are very high. And I think there is a lot of reasons for that. One reason is because of the enormous pressure people get from the working environment. So in countries like Japan and South Korea, Taiwan, there is enormous pressure from the working world, and that I believe is a continuation on from this school of thought of tiger parenting. But again, Amy Chua's concept of East versus West is again misleading. You do get Western parents who also have this very strict mindset. And you do get Eastern parents. You get parents in China who, like the Western counterparts, some of the Western counterparts, don't care, and they spoil their children rotten. In fact, that's one of the side effects of the one-child policy, which has now been discarded. You get so-called little emperors, who are basically spoiled brats, and the consequences of that is you do get long-suffering teachers. So the stereotype that we have in the West of all Chinese children being super well behaved is very misleading. It's not the case at all, and I can testify to that because I've been there. Um, so I'm going to round this up. Basically, I think this comes down to middle ground, common sense. Tiger parenting, as far as I'm concerned, is one extreme. Trying to create perfect people, telling children that they're worthless unless they get perfect grades. That to me is not love. I think that's got a lot more to do with the parents' sociopathic nature and their egoism than it has to do with wanting the best for the child. Maybe they convince themselves that's it, but children have to have a childhood. Of course, the limits have to be set, and parents have to take control over the children, and that is where there's the other extreme, where you get parents who have no control. And I would agree that there is a problem in some Western schools with discipline. I do think that's a serious issue, but ultimately, so much of this comes down to middle ground, common sense, balance. Instill the discipline when it's necessary, but let your children have a childhood and don't try to create perfect people. That's fundamentally what tiger parenting is about, and it frankly disgusts me because it actually says a lot about the parents' mindset to other people. It's the worst form of snobbery, and they always present it as being about love. Oh, we push them because we love them. You can push children, but within reason. Beating a child because they don't get exactly the grade you expect is not love. It's not. So I'll leave it there. Let me know your thoughts. All I'm arguing is it's about balance. So I have contempt for the tiger parenting model. I think it's for all the reasons I've said. But that doesn't mean I endorse the other extreme. Discipline is important, has its place. It's about balance, people. That's common sense. Let me know your thoughts.